After going through this video, you will be able to explain various database related functions, use database related functions. So far, we know that database related functions help us to communicate with the database. Let us understand a few database related functions in detail. First, we have a MySQLi connect function. As the name suggests, it is used to establish a connection with the MySQL server. And this is the query that we need to use to establish the connection. This query has four parameters. The host name parameter is the domain name or the IP address of the computer on which the MySQL server is running. If you have to guess the IP address of the computer on which the MySQL server is running, what would that be? The IP address will be 127.0.0.1 as the MySQL server and the web server are running on the same computer. The next parameter is the MySQL username, which in our case by default is root. Next is password parameter. And lastly, we have the name of the database parameter to which we want to communicate. $con is the reference object which represents the connection to the MySQL server. If the information of any of these parameters is incorrect while running the SQL query, the function will return a false value. This means it has failed to establish a connection. Suppose we could not establish the connection with the MySQL server. To establish the connection, we first need to identify the issue. So, is there any function in the PHP that can help us to identify the reason? The answer to our question is yes. We have a MySQLi connect error function that returns the last error message from the last call to MySQLi connect. This function returns the value as an error message that describes the error. Also, note that we don't use any parameter to use this function. Next, we have the MySQLi query function. It helps to execute an SQL query on the selected database. This is the syntax for this function. This is the function. And this SQL query takes two parameters. The first one is the connection reference object, which we have already discussed earlier. And the second parameter is the SQL query in the form of a string. This function returns a false value if due to any reason the query fails to execute. And it returns the value as true if the query is executed successfully. For select queries, it returns a reference object. Now, this reference object contains some data which can be accessed using the MySQLi fetch assoc function. And we can use this function like this. This is the name of the function and this is the reference object that we got from the MySQLi query function. Suppose this is the new data which we have fetched from the students table using the select query. This PHP function will fetch the first row and moves the internal pointer to the next row. Also, the single row data that is fetched is in the form of an associative array with the table attribute names as the key and the corresponding data stored as the values. So, the next time we use this PHP function, it will fetch the second row and will move the pointer to the next row. Similarly, the function fetches all the rows and when there is no row left, it returns the value as false. Next, similar to the MySQLi connection function, we have MySQLi error function. This function returns the last error message for the last call to the MySQLi query. This means if our SQL query fails to execute, using this function we can get the exact reason of the failure as an error message. This is the syntax that we use to use this function, in which we can see that it takes the connection reference object as the parameter. Lastly, we have MySQLi close function. This function closes the previously opened connection with the MySQL server. To close the connection, we pass the connection reference object along with the function name like this. Although the connection with the MySQL server is automatically closed once the entire PHP code is executed. But we should close the connection as a good practice as it also helps to free the resources used. Before we proceed further, let us quickly summarize the functions which we have learned so far using the client-server communication diagram. The first step is to establish the connection with the MySQL server, for which we will use the MySQL connect function. In case the connection does not get established, then we use the MySQLi connect error function to identify the issue. Once the connection is established, we use the MySQLi query function to run SQL queries on the connected database. And if due to any reason we are unable to execute the SQL queries, we have the MySQLi error function to identify the error message. Lastly, once the entire PHP code is executed, we close the connection using the MySQLi close function. In the next video, we will create a PHP file that will fetch the data a user will enter, and then we will store this data in a database. See you soon.